Yep. Is the lights coming on? Yep. There we go. Welcome back, everyone. Welcome back to day 2 of the 12th National Housing Conference, and thank you to Link Wentworth for their support of this plenary session. Those of you who've been to national housing conferences before in the last few years will recall some of the more memorable, some of the more volatile sessions have been around states of the nation, where we've had the chief executives of state housing agencies and representatives of the Commonwealth Government on a large panel talking about the current issues. This year, for reasons that probably don't need a lot of explanation, some of the senior officials weren't able to be here today. Obviously, we're very mindful of the flood situation to our north. COVID challenges have played havoc across the country and across the globe. So rather than have a bank of TV screens for senior officials who weren't able to be in the room, we decided to pivot and do something a little bit different with this session. And so today we're bringing together a panel of leading thinkers across a range of segments of our housing systems, representing housing policy, housing financing, public, community and private rental systems, home ownership programs, housing research and housing advocacy. To be honest, this is something of a dream lineup. When we decided we were going to take this approach, I just got on the phones, and it's a real testimony to the sort of sector we work in that not one person hesitated in taking part in this panel. They all just said yes before I really even finished the question. So I thank them all for being here today, and I'm really looking forward to this discussion. But before I introduce this panel, we just have a short message from the sponsor of this plenary session, Link Wentworth.
The one thing I've valued about being a Link Wentworth resident is the way that I'm treated as a tenant. There's just this genuine friendliness. I'm treated as a decent human being, no matter what my circumstances are.
I think after you've been in housing for a while, you realise it's not actually about housing, it's actually about people. So I really do like the interactions with our tenants. You know, our tenants are genuinely good people, so it's a pleasure to be doing the job that we're doing.
I've seen lots of really exciting things in the new organisation. We've got staff with a really deep and wide level of experience and capability, and we've got a board that has all of the expertise areas that you would like to see covered.
And what many people don't see is the directors reflecting in the board meeting on what does our future look like. So yes, we've brought two great organisations together to form the great Link Wentworth. That's a step on a journey for the organisation as it grows, as it provides more services to the community, and as it spreads its influence with government in policy.
Since joining Link Wentworth, one thing that I have noticed is we are absolutely delivering great housing outcomes for those vulnerable members of our community that without us would quite possibly end up in a much more vulnerable situation.
Over the last 8 years that I've been at Link Wentworth, one of the key objectives has been sustainable growth. So by working with great partners, whether they're youth providers like Burdekin and Platform Youth Services or women's community shelters, you realise if you try to work where everyone wins, you actually get more advocates and you get more ability to do more.
Link Wentworth has been a great partner for us because they have been prepared to say yes and to think outside of the square, and the focus clearly has always been on the clients and the client outcomes that can be achieved. There's a shared vision, a shared perspective, and a really clear and robust way of working.
Social and affordable housing doesn't just provide amazing secure homes for people in housing need, it also provides jobs. So moving into 2022 and 2023, the economy needs stability. The economy and the construction industry needs a pipeline of jobs and guaranteed workflow. So there is no better way of securing tradies jobs in the future than actually by delivering a pipeline of good quality social and affordable housing.
Having this home, to me it's meant security, that I haven't had the worry of continuing to pay a higher rent. It's a place for my grandchildren as well to come, and it's a security for them as well.
Thank you again to Link Wentworth. So today's panel is a really diverse group, it's a really interesting group, and I'm going to introduce them from my right, from your left, starting with Professor Emma Baker, who's a Professor of Housing Research at the University of Adelaide. Luke Bosher is Executive Director of Housing Policy at Homes Victoria, and I should also particularly thank Luke because Ben Rimmer, the Chief Executive of Homes Victoria, was to be in that seat until this morning when urgent business called him away, and I think Luke won the race to get to the seat, so well done, Luke. Rebecca Pinkstone is Chief Executive Officer of Bridge Housing in Sydney. Nathan Dalbon, Chief Executive Officer of NHFIC, the National Housing Finance and Investment Corporation, owned by the Commonwealth. Heather Holst is Victoria's Commissioner for Residential Tenancies. There
That's
you go.
the one, yeah.
I'm glad you have to say that more than me. And a member of the Social Housing Regulation Review Panel as well. And then Adrian Pisarski is the Executive Officer of National Shelter, I think for another couple of weeks.
4 weeks or so.
Who's counting? All right. The format for this session, I'm going to ask each of our speakers to offer 3 or 4 minutes of observations of where we are and where we've come from. And because we have people who are all in the room this time, it'll be a little easier to keep people to time. So I'm going to actually be a bit more assertive this time. 3 or 4 minutes, starting off with a really simple question. You know, in the last couple of years, since the last National Housing Conference, if you like, we've had a really challenging couple of years as a housing system, as a housing sector, as a nation. What have we learnt? And how are we going to take those learnings to achieve better housing outcomes into the future? I'll start with Emma.
Thank you, Michael. Well, I suppose, the elephant in the room is COVID and reflecting on pre and post, hopefully post-COVID. I think, what's happened with COVID is it's caused us to kind of throw out a lot of the assumptions that we had for the Australian housing system. It's kind of shaken up what we value about housing and what we do with housing and what we think we can do or can't do with housing to fix problems. So it's really, from our perspective, kind of shone a really big light on the homes that Australians live in, what the design is, what the layout is, what the location is, what the affordability is. For example, if you think of that first lockdown when everybody had to work from home, before that, working from home was was impossible to do, and overnight it became something that we had to do. So, it changed the way that we use our homes straight away, and I think probably all of us have been in Zoom meetings with people doing Zoom from their bed or an ironing board or something like that, and we may have done it ourselves. But it changed a lot of things that the housing market's based on too. So, the location became important. So people became uncoupled from work, which meant that they could live in sea change locations. Apartment living, it was designed for people to have a small amount of space, use all of the public infrastructure, all of the gardens. And when we look at how people in apartments did during COVID, they did the worst mentally because they were stuck in places that really weren't designed to be lived in 24 hours a day. I think, though, talking more positively, that COVID's really been a really great leveller. We were all hit, probably for the first time, regardless of our income or our wealth, in the same way. We all kind of had to lock down. We were kind of all in this together for maybe the first time we've ever really been all in this together for housing. So I think that it made us think about the housing that we have and that we want. But I think maybe also it made us think about the type of housing that other Australians have. So it kind of made us think, what is the minimum housing that Australians should actually have access to? And it kind of made us think collectively. I've got a really neat example, actually. Can you ever think of a time in Australian history when mum and dad landlords gave a discount to their tenants almost all at the same time? I mean, lots of them didn't, but lots of them did. And you think, that's a massive change to the way that, housing runs in Australia. So I think, COVID probably also helped us as housing bods. All of us in the room, we've probably been shouting a little bit into the void about housing being important, but kind of overnight, it became essential for education, for employment, and I think most importantly, it became essential for health. I think that finally, I'm a housing and health researcher, so we've been trying to tell this story for years and years and years, but all of a sudden health people got housing. So housing became this frontline public health weapon that we could use. So I think that's kind of changed forever. A nice example is probably the NHMRC funded a Centre of Research Excellence for Healthy Housing, which is the first time I can ever remember them, making a major investment into housing research. So, as we kind of head forward, I think there's, well, from my perspective, I'm a bit optimistic. I think that what it's done is kind of shaken up our values and our priorities. It's reminded governments especially that housing isn't just a commodity, that, it serves a purpose that can't be monetised. I suppose it's made us all conscious and concerned about other Australians and given us a window, and I'm sure someone on this panel will talk about it soon, the example of housing the homeless almost overnight is a pretty incredible example. So I suppose as we kind of head forward, people are going to be forgetting the lessons gradually. They're going to be gradually returning, to old behaviours and old ways of thinking about housing. But I don't think we'll ever be the same as we were before COVID, and I think that's a positive thing to head forward on.
Thanks, Emma. And I should say that while I'm starting the discussion with that overarching question, please feel free to put questions through on the app, and we'll come to those shortly. Before that, though, Luke, from your perspective, how have the last couple of years gone?
Thanks, Michael. Well, Emma kind of talked about this shake-up in housing, and keen to reflect a bit on what that shake-up's looked like from a Victorian perspective, a state housing authority perspective, but also keen to reflect on, how do we make the most of that shake-up and what does it mean for the years ahead? Because I think this is a real opportunity to use the shake-up to recognise that actually the structural design of social housing in Australia is broken, and it's been broken for a long time. I think this is the opportunity to use that shake-up to really drive systemic change in the way our system's designed. And I think we can probably all acknowledge that housing's been broken in Australia for quite a long time. Perhaps the most kind of obvious indicator of that is that 30 years ago social housing was about 7% of Australia's housing stock. Today nationally, it's only just above 4%. In our state, in Victoria, it's only just above 3%. Where we have less housing stock per social housing stock per capita than any other jurisdiction in Australia. And us, like other jurisdictions, aren't stabilising at the rate of social housing that we have. We're going to continue to decline in the system that we're operating in. And that's, not to in any way discount the huge investment that Victoria's made, other jurisdictions have made during COVID, but it kind of goes to the structure, I think, and the design of our social housing systems. So I think for many people in this room, we're kind of achieving success in spite of the system that we're working in, not because of the system that we're working in. And I think now's the kind of moment, post-COVID, to really relook at how the system's designed so that we're achieving success because of our system, not in spite of the way that our system's been designed. And clearly everyone in this room and in the homelessness and housing sector are real experts in making the most of the few resources that we have. I think the sector's really expert at turning kind of $1 into $5. And over the last 2 years, to kind of reflect on that period of time, I think we've made big steps forward in how we do better on financing and how we do better at bringing in different types of capital, reducing the cost of capital to make the subsidies that we've got go further. And I think that's been a great achievement of the last 2 years, of the last kind of 5 years. But at the end of the day, we can't achieve what we want for communities and what communities deserve around social housing by just being more efficient with the money that we've got. I think we really need to think about the structural design of our housing system to get that right so that we're operating efficiently, but we're operating efficiently with a pie that's significantly bigger than the pie that we've currently got in the social housing system. And I don't think that can happen in the design of our current social housing system. And clearly this is kind of all happening for us in social housing and homelessness in a bigger context of house prices growing more than incomes, more households renting versus owning, households being in significant rental stress across the country, and CRA no longer really providing that exit out of rental stress that perhaps it did a while ago. So it shouldn't be a surprise to any of us that our social housing waiting lists are growing, that we've got more than 150,000 Australians on social housing waiting lists across the country. And it also shouldn't therefore be a surprise with less housing stock as a percentage of the community's housing stock, that we've got a more residualised housing system that's housing more people with more complex needs. For us in Victoria, 10 years ago, 70% of those moving into housing were from the priority list. Last year it was 90% for us in Victoria. So as we have fewer housing, the way our system is designed, we will continue to house a higher proportion of people with even more complex needs. But that's leading to a system that's more residualised and unsustainable, unsustainable for our tenants and unsustainable for organisations. So I guess my proposition today is that the world around us has changed, and I think we need to change our social housing system in response, and I don't think that's a kind of tinkering around the edges. I think it's quite significant, fundamental, structural redesign of how housing works in Australia. And so, how has that kind of been affected by COVID? That's not because of COVID. That's been a long-standing issue for all of us in social housing. But COVID's kind of really changed these dynamics, as Emma talked about. We've got much more significant regional housing affordability pressures across the country in a very different way than we did pre-COVID. And the community, I think, understands more than ever how precarious housing situations of many Australians are. And we've started to value what's local to us a lot more than we used to. I think another big theme that we might kind of come back to in the questions is the kind of focus on key workers and affordable housing, not just for those most in need, but for our essential workers across the community who are really kind of put in the spotlight during COVID. But most of all, I think COVID's made us all think of housing as really critical social infrastructure, not just a welfare system, but actually important social infrastructure for all of the community. And Emma talked about the health interface with that. But that critical social infrastructure role of having temporarily fixed homelessness in most jurisdictions, and programs like Homeless to a Home in Victoria that showing that we can get chronically homeless people into long-term, stable, secure housing are real transformations and are a real credit to the way that housing systems have stepped up during the COVID situation. We also did a whole range of reforms across the country on tenancies, whether it's rent moratoriums or evictions freezes, and housing's been at the forefront of economic recovery. So, I think for all of us, housing as critical social infrastructure is a new dialogue. It's a new way to position housing post-COVID, but we haven't yet baked it into the public narrative. And I don't think that our current structure and our current design of social housing is what we need to make it as critical social infrastructure in the future. So keen to come back and talk about what some of those ways are, but I do think we need a pretty bold step change in how we think about housing and how we've designed our social housing system, and that's only going to happen if we work together. States working more closely together, the Commonwealth being at the table in a real and significant, meaningful way, which isn't the case at the moment and hasn't been the case for many years. But I think just to kind of finish on a theme that's been kind of, very public this week. At the end of the day, this is a pretty bare-knuckled fight for resources in the social housing system. It's expensive to fix this problem, and we need to mount a very credible case publicly that policy bureaucrats are part of, advocates are part of, and community is part of, to make the case of really redesigning social housing to get the amount of funding and the system design that social housing needs as essential infrastructure.
Terrific. Thanks, Luke. I think shifting that public narrative is the first step to that step change, so it's really useful. Rebecca.
Thanks, and I'd like to acknowledge that we're on Aboriginal land and pay my respects to Elders past and present, and the leaders, many of them are here with us today. I suppose I'm reflecting from a provider perspective, a practitioner perspective on the implications of COVID. And Bridge Housing is a community housing provider based in Sydney. We provide homes for over 5,500 people in 3,500 homes in metropolitan Sydney. And I think what COVID really clearly demonstrated for everyone was the importance that a safe, secure and affordable housing, a home, has for people, and the pandemic really raised the importance of that for everyone in the community. And one of the striking things we saw was the amount of investment that went into rough sleeping and moving people straight from the streets into a home. Bridge Housing, we've been doing this for 10 years. Housing First works. It is the way to end homelessness. And we've had all of these pilot programs. Now we need to see the reforms that are coming through and create a systemic approach to ending rough sleeping in our community. We can do it. We've proven it. The other thing that we saw was the value of social landlords like bridge housing, community housing providers and public housing at this time of crisis. Because as we've residualised the social housing system, we've created the most vulnerable people in our homes. We are housing the most vulnerable people in our communities. Over 75% of our households were sole person households, and they're ageing. So when we had to pivot our service delivery to online, that wasn't so easy to do. And we really had to engage with our tenants around their everyday needs. We were doing wellbeing calls, and all community housing providers were doing this, and we were providing essential basic level services around groceries, around getting medical supplies, because those community connections that we have, our family networks and friends that we take for granted, many people in our communities don't have that. And that's why social landlords are so important in filling that gap, in stepping through. But it also, I think, really raised for us the digital divide in our community. You know, over 90% of our tenants have a mobile phone. That's not a problem, but they don't have access to the data to be able to stream and get online and engage properly. So when we were sort of changing our community engagement activities to being online, trivia, connecting with our tenants, actually a significant amount of our work had to go into digital literacy, helping people understand how to engage and helping them to engage with a direct subsidy to get online and get data. So there is a digital divide in our community. It's been fantastic to see the way services can reorient, but actually people need assistance to be able to do that in a meaningful way. And for social landlords and community housing providers, we're thinking about what does that mean in terms of the design of new buildings, access to Wi-Fi in your own home, and how your community engagement and frontline service delivery can actually support tenants in the broader way of engaging in the community. We also saw historically low levels of arrears within social housing. Actually, we have a not-for-profit real estate across all elements of rental housing, and that's a combination of yes, some landlords responding to that with reduced rent, but it was also the increase in Commonwealth subsidies back to people's pockets. And what we saw through those subsidies were that people not only had dignity, but they had an extra buffer to be able to deal with everyday crises that were emerging within their lives. The extra costs associated with the pandemic hit our residents really hard. And so we've always known that people on lower incomes are very good money managers, but this just brought it to the fore that we really need to be campaigning between the link between what our residents are earning on Centrelink benefits, and we need to raise the rate to be really equitable. Finally, I just wanted to say the amount of I suppose investment in social housing and affordable housing and infrastructure, we need to go back to the base level of that in terms of increasing the numbers of social and affordable homes. Community housing providers, we've been invested in to be that conduit. We know that a direct subsidy from government is the most efficient form, channeled through the community housing sector. We have NHFIC, we can access that private funding, we can work with developers to deliver housing at a more affordable rate. So we really do need to go back to the base level of what is the most efficient way to deliver more social and affordable housing in the system. That's through community housing providers, working in partnership with government and our private sector partners. We can't ignore the 150,000 people that are on that waiting list around Australia. We can't ignore 1 million people on low incomes that are struggling with financial security and unaffordable housing. So we need to really take the COVID lessons. Safe, affordable homes protect our communities, they protect our tenants, and we need to invest in that.
Thanks, Rebecca. You're right, we have NHFIC. We have NHFIC here.
That was you, freaking you, Nathan.
Excellent, thanks, Rebecca. I'll take care of you for the next loan as well. Thanks, Michael. And let me again just pay my compliments to you and your team for organising another great conference. I must confess, I was quick to say yes when you rang me up. I must say I was pretty desperate for human interaction at that stage, so apologies to everyone that I've been chewing the ear of for the last 24 hours or so. But look, it's been great, to actually interact and talk to people again. And, technology's been great, but you certainly can't beat human interaction. So congratulations again. Just quickly about NHFIC. We're a Commonwealth organisation. We were set up 4 years ago, almost 4 years ago by the Commonwealth. Our initial focus was primarily on financing for social and affordable housing. We also had an infrastructure facility which we've been using to support unlocking new supply by the provision of infrastructure. We had a small capacity building program for the community housing sector, which is still running. And we've had 2 new functions added after the last election, one focused on research into housing supply and demand and affordability, and also a number of schemes focused on assisting initially first home buyers, but more broadly with the family home guarantee, a broader range of individuals into owning housing. So 4 observations that I had, and I had many, I guess, from COVID. One, being a financier, focusing on interest rates. Certainly NHFIC and the provision of long-term affordable finance has made a substantial difference, is my observation, in terms of the viability of community housing projects. But one of the biggest changes and one of the biggest areas that moved the dial in terms of viability of projects over the last 2 years was the decline in interest rates, which meant that when we go out and access finance from institutional investors, we were able to access finance at an incredible rate. And unfortunately, that's not going to happen going forward. So what that means is that's going to put additional pressure on other means to close that viability gap when it comes to community housing projects, and that puts additional pressure and attention on state governments, Commonwealth governments, local governments, in terms of working together to make these projects viable. So I think we do need to work harder going forward. We know that budgets are constrained after a lot of the stimulus spending, and I think my view is that overall the states and the Commonwealth work particularly well together in terms of responding to COVID and the challenges that threw up. A lot of us never had to deal with something like that, so I think considering everything, I think the response has been good. There's always things you could do better, but obviously going forward we need to start to think about not just the cyclical side, but then the underlying structural factors which are going to drive new housing supply going forward. Another observation for me, which sort of goes to Rebecca's point, just relates to the resiliency of the community housing sector. So one of the downsides when you're trying to get a deal to be viable is the low rate of return. The positive is that it's very stable and it grows over time. The other positive about the community housing sector is how close they are to the tenant. So for that arrears management, for example, is critical. When you are in situations where people are feeling they're under financial pressure, and being able to work with the tenant makes a huge difference. And I think that stability of cash flows is increasingly important, particularly in terms of attracting external finance. Because external finance is looking, I think, to invest in the sector. And that resilience and long-term stability that the sector has demonstrated, I think, is important in terms of building investor confidence in the sector. But most importantly, it just reflects also the human nature of what we're dealing with. And that's part of the reason why NHFIC exists. We're here to support the community housing sector because of its close affinity with its tenants. The third thing I'd emphasise is just the ESG agenda. When we first started 4 years ago, one of the early decisions we made was because of the strong link between our finance and then being channeled directly to community housing providers, it made sense to have the bonds classified as a social bond. And at the time, I guess you had a bit of a feeling that, yeah, I like it, sounds great, but it sounded a bit like lip service in terms of some of the discussions you had. What I've seen in the last 12 months in particular, that's completely changed. People say it with conviction. They really mean it. So the issue we have is if we've got a wall of cash, that wants to be deployed into the sector, we can't actually find enough projects on the other side because of the viability of projects to actually deploy the funds. So I think, when you look at NHFIC, for example, when we look at our bonds, we've had 6 bonds. We've had our first sustainability bond last year to support the Victorian Public Housing Renewal Program. We went out to 15-year tenor. Every time we go out for a bond, we're oversubscribed multiple times. And the pricing that we're receiving on the bonds has compressed substantially over the last 3 years. So I think there's a real opportunity there to sort of, NHFIC, we're now the biggest Australian social bond issuer in Australia. There's a real opportunity to ride that wave. As I say, we've got to work hard on the actual deployment side, I think, to deploy those funds. The last thing I'd say is affordability. So we had our second State of the Nation, quite appropriate given the title of this session, released last week.
We had the name first.
Of course you did. We'll talk about copyright later. So look, you can't hide from the affordability story, right? When you look at the affordability analysis in the State of the Nation, it's quite stark. There's no other way to put it when you look at first home buyers or whether you're a renter. And it's not just a Sydney story anymore. It's actually nationwide when you look at the affordability numbers, and there's no quick fix to this. I think that's one lesson. So it requires a medium to long term focus to say, well, this is what we want to achieve. This is how we're going to achieve it, and then you need to stay the course. And I think that's been one issue in terms of government policy over the years, is the chopping and changing of policy. If you want to have a pipeline, and if you want to give investors confidence, you need to stay the course. That's critical. And it's just, in some respects, it's quite amusing that, decades and decades of regional policy, which was trying to shift people into the regions, has been unsuccessful, but it took a virus to actually get people to move into the regions. But I suspect that's, some form of that is going to be the new norm. So we need, as policy, as people involved in policy, we need to think about what the new norm is. And I think a sustained effort in terms of supply is obviously key to looking at affordability issues going forward, and it's across the continuum. It relates to home ownership, it relates to key worker, it relates to social, it relates to homelessness. There needs to be a coordinated response that looks at the whole continuum as opposed to piecemeal, approaches to various parts of it. And I think that's where the Commonwealth, state, local government, policymakers, academics, advocates, the whole sector really do need to work together to find that long-term solution.
Thanks, Nathan. It sounds a little bit like a national strategy. Heather, you wear many hats. I mentioned a couple of them before. What are the things that have been occupying your mind of late?
Thanks, Michael. Thanks for the opportunity to sort of reflect a bit. It's slightly scary in some ways to stop and reflect at times like this. So my main two hats are Commissioner for Residential Tenancies in Victoria, which is a role that was brought in 2018 to act as an advocate for tenants in Victoria, residential tenants. The idea being that residential tenants didn't get enough say in housing policy in the matters that very, very critically affect them. And obviously agree that they don't. The other role that I have on a more temporary basis is the review of social housing regulation in Victoria. So my feelings, depending on which hat, are quite different actually. To take the period since some of us got together in Darwin and in our innocence, had the housing conference up there, a lot has happened. Obviously the pandemic, first and foremost. And I can remember when people were saying that housing prices and rents would drop and keep dropping. Well, a little bit of that happened in a few places, but fundamentally this has actually been a story of enormous upheaval, particularly for the private tenants of Australia, I would say, but I can speak most about Victorian tenants. I would say that Victorian tenants have been the same people who've kept the groceries on the shelves and who kept the burgers able to be brought by Uber or whatever you do. So a lot of people who I'm interested in weren't actually sent home, they were sent out in it. And this is well before vaccines, right? They were also told that there would be something called an eviction moratorium. By the time that was even announced, a lot of people had had a look at things and made their own arrangements and realised that they were stuffed, basically, and kind of left housing in droves. For the first time in Victoria, the number of rental bonds dropped. First time since we've been taking stats on that. So the size of the rental sector contracted because people were moving in with each other, the overcrowding, the kind of going and making good with mum back in the country town or whatever it was you had to do was done. So I would say that what we've seen is, for private tenants, a brunt bearing happened. And it's true that once we got the measures in, the rental measures that were similar in a lot of the states and territories actually, there was a real slowdown on some of that. And for the first time, tenants had someone on their side. They couldn't be at least officially evicted unless they went to VCAT first. They could still be evicted for many things, of course. It wasn't a full moratorium. And people were surprised that VCAT were interested in what they wanted to do. That they rang them and said, what do you want to do about this case? People were amazed, Anyway, so some of that was good. And that I think, like some of the other people have remarked, does tell us that there is more that government can do with a mind to it to add some strength to tenants. But then fairly soon after the moratorium came off, once it was no longer a public health emergency, perceived to be, and then off go the rent prices, off go the sales. A 60-day notice to vacate because your owner wants to move back in or they want to sell isn't very long in a very, very tight market. This is still going on. So people are still having enormous problems because of the upheavals in the private rental market. I know I haven't got all day here, but I would just call out what's happened to regional renters in particular. During this period, we were doing a project with the Aboriginal communities of Victoria on how to get better access to private rental, and at the same time they're being knocked around having to move out of their homes because of the private rental squeeze that was happening in regional Victoria as well as metro. So I suppose that's with that hat on. The Commissioner hat, I've seen some things I'd rather not have seen in this period actually. It's been very sad in a lot of ways. And on the more optimistic hat, let's end on that one, the Social Housing Reg Review has been called because of the big investment that Luke mentioned into the big housing build, the determination to set things up properly, to make this not just a one-off investment. And it's clear that many of the tenants I just described needed social or affordable housing with the type of protections that come with that, not just the rent levels, but the certainties and the care. So that's the optimistic bit, and I'm just going to make a plug and say that the interim report is on the web. Officially, the feedback is closed, but we don't really mean that, so please give us more feedback. And we will pay a lot of attention to it. So I'll end on that more optimistic thing about a determination to improve social and affordable housing.
Thank you. An extension on submissions is always welcome.
They'll kill me. Sorry, Angelina.
Worth mentioning that the NHHA review has been extended as well to beyond this conference, which is very handy. Adrian.
Well, I agree with a lot of what's been said. I disagree with some of it, but I think I'm just trying to think about themes. One of them is short-termism. I think we've seen a real extension of short-termism in policy and thinking. For example, we showed that we can actually house all the rough sleepers in Australia in about a fortnight if we really want to, and save the hotel industry at the same time. You know, not a bad economic outcome as well as a homelessness outcome, but that didn't last long. As soon as the health threat receded, people were moved on, and to where? You know, you have to ask that question. We missed an opportunity for longer term thinking to permanently house those people through a range of programs, which we did advocate in conjunction with a whole range of other people, which were at the Commonwealth level ignored. At the state level we had better success. Some states did put in other programs for longer term housing options, etc. So that was a good thing. It confirmed that economic forecasters in the country and around the world are about as accurate as astrologers in terms of their house price forecast, for example. If you remember, the Commonwealth Bank said at the outset of the pandemic, prices could fall between 15 and 40%. Well, that came true, didn't it? So I think, you know, we've got to question the economic forecasts that are now emerging post-pandemic as much as we should have at the time. I think we have had a real increase in the perception and the value of housing for a whole range of reasons, and especially social housing as part of that. And I hope that the community coming out of this has a higher value placed on social housing that it went into the thing. One of the things I'm going to disagree with Rebecca slightly about is that the most efficient means of investing in social housing, whether it's through, you know, community housing or state housing authorities, is direct investment by government. And I think, Michael, you'll say that AHURI research backs me up on
Well, that's
on
what I
that.
said. Direct subsidy is the way to deliver.
No, direct funding. It would actually, the most efficient way would actually be borrow the money, build the housing.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's the most efficient.
You're in furious agreement.
Indeed. So that's good. And despite, I mean, I will get to the elephant in the room, which is Commonwealth government inaction on housing, despite, you know, some good signs on national solidarity through the National Cabinet process. It wasn't evident on housing. I mean, we've seen some good things done around NHFIC, and that's been very welcome. The lifting of the cap and on the guarantee has been welcome, but it's really far too little to impact the scale of the problem that we have. What we have seen is $10.9 billion or more worth of commitments by state governments. That's fantastic, but none of that's been matched at the Commonwealth level, and engagement with the Commonwealth around social housing invariably gets the response, it's a state responsibility. We cannot continue to countenance the fantasy that the people of Australia are somehow divisible between what's a state and a Commonwealth responsibility. They're both responsible, as is local government, as is the private sector, as is the general community. We are all responsible for this, and we need to hold every level of government to account for that. And it's not a party political thing, it's just, you know, if we look back at the history of social housing in Australia, we've got a 75-year history of joint Commonwealth state investment in social and affordable housing in Australia. You can ignore that if you like, but you can't deny it. And especially when you're already investing heavily in the subsidisation of private home ownership through capital gains tax exemptions, with investors through capital gains tax exemptions and negative gearing, when you're investing in Commonwealth rent assistance, when you've committed to the NHFIC, Clearly the Commonwealth accepts a responsibility at one level. It cannot therefore turn around and just say social housing is a state responsibility. That's really the elephant in the room. So to kind of get around that, we've been building alliances with the private sector, with superannuation funds, to develop products which you know, if they were adopted, would fit that gap between what superannuation. So we've got billions and billions of dollars sitting in superannuation funds wanting to invest in this stuff. We've got a huge human need that needs investment in this stuff. There's a really tiny gap in between that meets the difference between the cost of doing it and the income streams and the various elements that you can pull together to do it. Surely we need to come to the point where the federal government steps up and says, we will fill that gap. You know, that's really what we need. There's a bunch of other things that I could go into. You know, the regional impact has been profound. The movement to the regions has been quite dramatic. Will we ever be the same again? Hard to say. There's still a long way to go in that discussion. But we have had a lot of innovative thinking emerge about how to address the problems. But I'll go back to the thing that I started on. We need to have long-term thinking about all of these things, not the short-termism that we too frequently experience.
Thank you. One of the recurrent themes in a number of those observations, and certainly a recurrent theme in the questions that are coming through the app, is about that long-term thinking, is about that involvement of multiple tiers of government. It's not just a state responsibility, about the importance of a national strategy going forward. And look, clearly we don't have a national housing strategy at this time, and that's not going to change between now and the election. But how do we grab this moment to move towards one, regardless of election outcomes? And in fact, moving beyond being dependent on election outcomes, how do we get to that point? Look, this is something you talked a little bit about. Do you want to pick up some more on that?
Sure, thanks, Michael. You know, from a Victorian perspective, we're very supportive of having a national housing strategy. You know, going back to this kind of point around our system isn't designed right. You know, and Adrian's point that, you know, this is not a problem that individual states can resolve. It's also not a problem the Commonwealth can resolve by itself. You know, if we don't have a national strategy and a strong national partnership with re-established national governance that has decision makers from the states and territories around the table, we're not going to be able to fix the kind of structural design problems that we've got in the social housing system, and certainly not the broader kind of housing policy settings. So we're very supportive of that. The PC opportunity through the review of the NAHA could be one way to do that. I guess I'd also say, you know, on those kind of bigger structural changes, you know, I also want to highlight some of the things that are happening, right? Like there are, without having a national housing strategy, we are seeing some pretty big structural changes. You know, for state housing authorities, you know, we're seeing in Victoria and also Tasmania as of last week, really kind of carving out and giving more prominence to state housing authorities with a wider mandate to include social and affordable housing. Like this is a pretty big structural change to go back to a world of more standalone housing authorities, but with a bigger mandate for a broader cohort of the population. And the work that Heather's doing on the social housing reg review is another example of getting the structural settings right for the kind of medium and long term. I guess just one other issue that we haven't spoken very much about that I think should absolutely be a feature of a national strategy is the role of Aboriginal Australians in self-determination on the housing agenda. I think it's another example of these big structural changes that are coming for housing that we've, you know, in some states are a bit further ahead than others. But, you know, absolutely the role of Aboriginal Australians and organisations owned and run by Aboriginal Australians in owning the wealth of the social housing system and making genuine decisions about what housing is needed for their communities. I think these are the kind of themes that a national housing strategy needs to deal with, and that the Commonwealth has, you know, really useful levers and useful perspectives to bring. So bring on a national housing strategy from Victoria's perspective.
Thanks, Luke. Nathan, I know you don't speak for the whole of the Commonwealth. You don't speak for every decision made. But from your perspective, would it make a difference to have a national housing strategy?
Look, I think I'll answer that by saying, just returning to my earlier comments, just in terms of the advantages of having that medium-term objective, this short-termism. I mean, ultimately, those decisions are political decisions. I think on the eve of the federal election, it's obviously a good time to use the democratic processes to advance those ideas, and I think have a robust discussion. And I think there's a lot of merit to having that discussion. Ultimately, where government lands, obviously, will be their issue. I think the basic idea, though, is we've all got to work together, right? I spent a lot of my time listening to stakeholders and working hard to try and develop partnerships across all the people that you need to bring together to actually make housing work. I very much, from my organisation's point of view, we want to do business in Victoria. We want to do business in every jurisdiction. We want to focus on particular groups that we know need further assistance. The Indigenous community, vulnerable women. We're willing to step up and try and find the solutions to house all people. Now, obviously, we can only go so far, right? We have the benefit of that long-term cheap finance, but as others have said today, you need other parts to that financing solution to make it work. And it's not just money. When you talk to a number of community housing providers in terms of their interactions, in terms of getting approvals, for example, the timeframes, the cost, some of the community issues that you have to deal with. It's broader than just finance. There's a whole range of issues that need to be brought out. And I've said this before, like, if you're going to, particularly if you've got, say, strong increases in population in a particular community, you need to have a consensus within that community. You need to have the infrastructure in place so that people's amenity, still remains intact and in fact enhanced. And I think there is a benefit of having a cohort of people within community, so we don't retreat into, this is a wealthy suburb, this is, a poor suburb. I don't think any of us want that. So how do we develop an integrated community is a much deeper question. And I think on that front, we're failing. I think we need to bring all these different levers together and work together. And that's not a short-term fix.
I think there are some really interesting questions about what are the elements of a national strategy? What is the scope of it? What does it cover? The review of the National Housing and Homelessness Agreement is generating a similar discussion about what its scope should be, what its breadth should be. Before the NHHA, we had NAHA and NPA for affordable housing, homelessness, and NAPARI for remote and Indigenous housing. And the first two were rolled into the current agreement. The third was not, and that's quite a gap. So I think there are some really interesting questions around scale and scope there. Yeah. But I think one of the core elements is the growth of the social housing sector. Rebecca, what's needed to really bring the community housing sector to a grander scale?
Well, I think it goes back to talking about long-term strategy. Where does the community housing sector fit in the supply of social and affordable housing in Australia? We've moved towards, and I worked in the bureaucracy for many years, but we've moved towards a regulatory system that was designed to provide assurance around the delivery of community housing, to give financing confidence about our capability and capacity to do that. And I think that part of that national strategy has to be a strategy for how you want the community housing sector to fit in the delivery of social and affordable housing, because we don't have clarity of that policy. So all of the organisations can build up all of the capacity, but are the underlying structures there available to leverage that capacity. I think Nathan could be very honest about the thin balance sheets that community housing providers have. If you don't link reforms that are holistic, we won't actually be able to leverage the capacity of the sector. And I'm talking about things like title transfer to increase balance sheet capacity. We've had property transfers, but they're not always connected to title, which really gives you the depth and the ability to be able to leverage the portfolio and create a real difference. So I think part of that national housing strategy needs to be the role of the community housing sector in actually delivering more social and affordable housing. We already know that community housing providers provide a high level of service with very, very high tenant and resident satisfaction rates. We know we deliver that well. What do you want the community housing providers to do in terms of delivering more social and affordable supply, working across government? And I think the other element of the picture is how do you bring together all the layers of subsidy that are needed to create more social and affordable housing? We have some states giving land, some giving long-term leases, some asking us to get NHFIC. We've got to crowd that in with private funding. We've talked about institutional investment, but actually we need to be really clear about how all of the sources of funding and all of the levers are coming together to create more social and affordable housing. We need a clear strategy for how we want the community housing sector to deliver, because we've got the capacity. Actually, what's lacking is the political will and government will to let us do that.
Thank you. There's a terrific stream of questions coming through. Thank you, everyone in the room and those watching online. We're not going to get to all of the questions here, clearly, but I'm going to start jumping around a little bit more to bring in different themes and perhaps shift around the conversation a bit. There's one comment about the absence of resident voices in the keynote sessions, and yes, I'll acknowledge that. There's quite good representation of lived experience within a lot of the concurrent sessions, but in the keynotes that's less the case. So that's a fair criticism. But the question, I guess, that goes with that then is how do we bring residents along as partners in these developments? And Heather, there's a couple of comments here congratulating on you on championing that voice, both today and more broadly. But in terms of regulation review, how do we engage the tenant voice in that process?
Well, what we're proposing in the reg review for Victoria for social and affordable housing is that the tenants are the prime reason for it. So that we're proposing that it be, the well-being of tenants and prospective tenants be the purpose of social and affordable housing. And some of the ways we're proposing to achieve that, apart from centring that, and that comes when there's sort of dispute or doubt, that would be the determining overriding objective that it comes back to. But so, for example, we've been taking some advice from regulators overseas, and we're very enamoured with the Scots. And what they did was, when they reworked it in that way, was they put the chair of their regulator had that as their main mandate. They put extra people in senior leadership of their regulator with that lived experience and the entitlement to push that through. And they had to keep asking tenants and change things when tenants told them they weren't doing it very well, which is not very nice when you're a housing expert of many years standing, But that's what you've got to do. So it's actually, it's hard work. It's learning some new tricks in some cases, but it's magic. It means, of course, that what you're actually delivering is fit for the people who need it and who are part of it. So it's absolutely essential. And just one more comment, I suppose, is that in each of the cases, and the previous session we went to on the international examples too, there was already national consensus about the importance of social and affordable housing, the importance and value of it. We're still at bare knuckle fight, as Luke quite rightly put it, trying to establish that here and maintain what space we do have. So that's the other piece of it, and I think you've remarked that too today, Michael. getting, real public support, doing the work to do that.
Emma, the voices of residents is important across a whole range of tenancy forms. Some of the work you've been doing over the last couple of years has dug into that.
Yeah.
Do you want to share a little bit about that?
I suppose this feeds into what Heather was saying, but it was a few years ago we kind of realised that we didn't really know anything about what happened behind the front doors of Australian houses. So, the economists have been doing economic things, the banks have been doing their bit. We know a little bit about social housing, but really only because it needed to be insured. So the last time the Australian Bureau of Statistics ever did a national housing conditions survey was in 1999. So a group of us got together and said to the Australian Research Council, why don't we do a massive national survey and make it public, and then everyone can be singing from the same song sheet effectively. So we're in a process of doing that, but we were lucky enough to be running a large survey which is now available in the midst of COVID. So we got to go in and ask 15,000 renting households across the whole of Australia, what are your conditions like? How does it interact with work? What's wrong with your house? What's good with your house? What are your aspirations? Things like that. And I could talk all day about the findings from that. But one thing I was thinking of as everyone was talking is we also asked them, do you think your housing's affordable? And there's a big difference between the people who say their housing is affordable and the people that we put into the models for affordable housing. So I think one of the lessons from that is we need to do a bit more thinking about what affordable housing actually is. So it's very easy for us to say, let's just take the bottom 40% of the population and pick off all the people paying more than 30% of their household income for rent. It doesn't capture who's actually in affordable housing. So I think there's a bit of work to be done on that. Yeah. Can I just add, I think one of the other reflections from this is that without kind of a national shared aspirational plan, all of us are working separately, all madly trying to pull the right levers, do the right things, get the best possible outcomes. But actually some of that works against each other. So we're probably, working backwards rather than forwards until we get a plan.
Thank you. Adrian, there's a couple of comments here picking up on some of your earlier comments about all levels of government being involved. And of course there is a third tier of government, local government, that does have some presence at this conference. Not all 532 local governments are represented, I'll be honest, but there is certainly a presence. What do you see as the role of local government in that conversation around a national strategy in delivering more affordable housing and addressing homelessness?
Yeah, it's a good question. Certainly around local planning schemes, making sure that there are housing needs assessments done so that they've got a good handle on what the local need is within their local community is a good start. I know lots of local governments do housing plans and strategies. That's a good start. There's a big question mark about the planning system and what it can produce. We've all been aware of what's happened in Victoria over the last week, so it's the interaction between local government and state government legislative arrangements around planning, and of course the relationship between them and the very powerful private sector lobbies which say, yes, we'll agree to do that, or no, we won't. And we've seen that play out in Victoria over the last week in a quite dramatic way. But certainly the planning systems need to start producing a consistent pipeline of affordable and social housing along the way, so that they're, for all sorts of reasons, not just, obviously because we need to house the people who need it, but also so that there's a pipeline of planned housing coming along so that we can use the financial instruments like NHFIC and others that might yet emerge, etc., so that we can actually rationally go about this business instead of starting, it's different here to there, and all of that. There needs to be a much greater consistency across local governments. Now, I know local government is really interested in the issue of inclusionary zoning. The word mandatory often gets in the way in their discussions, and I know they've had those debates and votes on this at national levels. So I think we need to work with local government around that. I mean, mandatory inclusionary zoning oughtn't mean that if you've got 0 proportions of social housing, that next week you suddenly need 5% of social housing. There would be time frames, there would be reasons not to go down that direction. But when you're a local councillor and you hear the word mandatory inclusionary zoning, you think, how the hell do I get there? Or, you know, do I have enough, etc. So I think there's a lot of work to do with local government to create the conversations, to steady the nerves, to relax everyone around these concepts, as there is with the private industry sector. I mean, the private industry sector is used to throwing its weight around in all of these spaces. And one of the reasons that we've been involved in the National Affordable Housing Alliance is to open up the possibility of having those discussions so that we can at least engage around this stuff rather than on the battlefield of legislation. You know, that's not the best place to engage around this stuff. There needs to be consistent long-term engagement to resolve those issues. So, I mean, there's a few thoughts about local government. It can also provide land, you know, make Rebecca's job a lot easier by taking the cost of land out. You know, you can do almost anything if you take the cost of land out. You know, there are things like that. So there's a lot that local government can do.
Heather and perhaps Luke as well, one of the comments that's come through a couple of times, I think, is around that national consistency. And we talked about sort of stability of settings over time, but there's also a question of stability of settings across jurisdictions. And so we have a national regulatory system for community housing. We also have a Victorian system for regulation of community housing. What's the prospect of bringing them together?
That's a question for Heather.
Just to show that I'm not just bashing the Commonwealth.
Look, the social housing reg review, we decided we didn't think it was ready for Victoria to join. I must say, as one of the panellists, 3 panellists, I started out thinking, oh well, should be able to join the national system, you know. But the really big problem, well, there's a few, and that's a sort of, you know, outlined in the report. But we also think that conversations to make it so that it can be joined need to commence. So it's not just stand out, but to protect the integrity of what's being invested in Victoria and the focus on tenants is really contrary to what the current national system has, and that's just fundamental. So until that can be kind of gotten through, that's kind of what we're recommending in the interim reports. You know, taking feedback, but that's what we're recommending, because that absolute problem of you know, so to have a regulation of finances, regulation of governance are both crucial, critical, but you must also you know, do what is being delivered for tenants. And you have to put that there as actually ahead of those, because these serve that, and that's not the fundamental at this point. So, over to you, Luke.
Look, I think the tenant at the centre work and the perspective that the regulatory reviews brought to that in Victoria really does take us a step forward. I think it, you know, on that kind of structural design conversation, you know, I think putting tenants at the centre is one of the big structural shifts we need to move as a whole system. And, you know, individual organisations can do that well, individual community housing providers can do it extremely well. But, you know, we should set a floor across, in our view, we should be setting a floor across the system. You know, and, you know, in Victoria, we've decided in Big Housing Build that all net growth of Big Housing Build is managed by community housing providers. So, you know, from the kind of Rebecca strategy point before, you know, I think we've got a very clear strategy in Victoria, which is the growth of the community housing sector to manage all net growth in Big Housing Build. And, you know, what does that mean for a system? Well, for a system, it means that tenants need to have a minimum standard experience across public and community housing. Whichever organisation's housing them in the social housing system, they should expect the same minimum standards. I think the good work that the panel's done at putting people at the centre really will make public housing come up to that bar and make sure community housing's at that bar too. And I think to move to a national system that doesn't put people at the centre would be a step backwards from where we could be with the outcomes from the regulatory review.
There's another critical issue around regulation that I wouldn't mind raising, which is the position of a lot of Aboriginal community housing organisations around the country who don't fit the regulatory system because they can't qualify based on the rules of housing systems and charging 25% of income on rent and all of those sorts of things. And as I said to Natsiha's forum the other day, we've been asking how do we make Aboriginal organisations comply with the system, rather than actually asking what does the system need to look like to allow Aboriginal organisations to participate in it. And until we solve that problem, then we're not going to have a large-scale movement of Aboriginal people within and organisations within the system to take advantage of things like NHFIC or other programs that may come down the pipeline. So there's a big question for the regulatory system around that.
I agree. I think we have to look at, and I think we actually have to look at a regulatory system that covers all parts of the system, including public housing. I don't think it makes sense having just a community housing providers subject to a regulatory system. I think we need to review the regulatory system, look at where it needs to be flexible to make sure it reflects the diversity. But on a base level, if we're really talking about tenant outcomes, if we're talking about financing and the outcomes that we can get across social and affordable housing providers, public housing needs to be part of that regulatory system, and the transparency needs to operate across all providers.
Yes.
Nathan, picking up on similar themes to the comments that we've heard around the importance of tenant voice and the social outcomes, if you like, of community housing in particular. One of the comments coming in is talking about New Zealand's central bank focusing much more on ESG interpretations, not just strictly finance. Is there a role for an increased focus on ESG within Australia's central banks? Asking the big questions?
I have no idea. I can certainly say it makes a big difference for us.
Yep.
With NHFIC, as I was saying before, look, at the end of the day, I sort of see it as an opportunity to cheapen the finance that we source from the private sector and pass that through to the community housing sector. The other key thing for me is just this is me personally, but I'm very outcomes focused. So I've got the ESG side of the business saying, well, we want to see the outcomes. And it's like, sure, like no problem. Like you wouldn't have a clearer line between investments and outcomes. So this to me is just an obvious alignment here of interest, and from my perspective we want to drive that really hard going forward, because you look at what's happening overseas, quite clearly if that's the future, which I think it is, we're still a couple of years behind where they are. Yeah. And I think the CHP sector, the community housing sector, is incredibly well placed, as I said before, to ride that wave. I think, AHURI did some of that initial work for us in terms of looking at the outcomes that we're generating with the finance. I think there's a real opportunity to take that further, and I know there's some work underway at the moment with some of the peaks and us and other stakeholders looking at ways that we can further facilitate ESG investment into the sector. And I think the other thing is just the second round impacts is another issue that we continue to think about. I don't have a solution at this stage, but certainly when we talk to investors, they keep on bringing that issue up. So yes, very interested in terms of the increased supply, but they're also looking, well, tell me about how that person has managed to now have these broader benefits in terms of, for example, re-establishing their connection with employment, improving their education outcomes. What does it mean for their kids? And there are so many good stories out there which we've highlighted in our social bond report, and we had our third one last year, but I think we've got to drive that further. I don't think we're doing enough on that on those second round impacts. I think it's also, just very quickly, when you're trying to sell the proposition to governments in terms of this is a good investment. Unfortunately, too often you focus on the initial cost, right? But there's a second round benefit here which often isn't reflected in costings when it comes from a budget point of view. And that is, by putting people into stable accommodation, what are the other savings that you're generating because people aren't, they're not accessing welfare, for example. Or their kids are basically, they're paying tax. Their kids are sort of getting better educated and therefore not reliant upon other services. They're the things that aren't captured typically in a costing when it goes forward from a budget perspective.
And Michael, maybe can I just add to that? Because I think this also then feeds into this conversation about, how do we place social housing more at the centre of our public debate? And Emma spoke earlier about how during COVID, housing has been such a frontline response to COVID. And I think linking up, whether it's the health link, whether it's the kind of police and emergency services link, we know in Victoria, and some of you would have been to the session yesterday that Alex ran on our linked data, where we've linked up the data of all 120,000 public housing tenants in Victoria across our social service systems. We know that emergency department presentations, we can look at those trends, we can look at the impact of providing social housing to people who are experiencing homelessness and see those reductions. But I don't think as a system, as a state policy agency even, there's a lot more we could do to link in with those systems that do benefit from more social housing. I feel like we want the justice sector, we want the police, we want hospitals to really recognise why providing social housing is such a great response to deal with problems that they're facing around ED admissions or police call-outs. And I think we could do more to make good advocates for our cause across government and across the community with really great voices that have a lot of community prominence. And I think that should be part of our agenda for the next couple of years, whether it's local governments, as Adrian was saying, or whether it's hospitals and health services. I think there's a lot of people who know that they benefit from housing in a first, second or third order impact, but I don't know that we've done enough to activate those stakeholders to really be part of the national debate or even the state debate.
So I think the response to that, I think, is that we need to consider housing as infrastructure and social and affordable housing as essential infrastructure, because it does do all of those savings jobs in other areas of government expenditure. So it's essential for those reasons, in the same way that a hospital is. It's exactly the same in those sorts of terms. And housing in general is infrastructure. It's not recognised as a form of infrastructure in our planning systems, in our economic systems. I could refer you to the work of Duncan McLennan and whatnot on that, which articulates it not as succinctly as I am, I'd say, but in a more powerful way, perhaps. Sorry, Duncan.
I guess picking up on that point to a degree, and that the comparison with hospitals is a good one. One of the questions that's come through that's caught my eye is directed to you, Emma, but I suspect several others will want to make comment on this one as well. Looking at some of the models overseas that really connect housing and health service, which is about person-centred care. It's about putting the needs of vulnerable people at the centre of what you design as a response. So the example of the Alex in Canada, which is a terrific facility in Calgary that is a healthcare facility, but also manages homelessness response and intersocial housing in one spot. It's an astonishing facility. Is there room for that in Australia? Is there room for us to sort of expand into that more diverse set of service offerings, by the same organisation in the same place?
But I think the evidence is pretty clear on that. I mean, we all know it's true. You all know it's true. But we never act on it. So every time internationally when they do those experiments, so say in the US there's a brilliant case study of a hospital being charged so they don't get their payment for the patient if the patient reoccurs back in their door within 6 weeks. And so that very quickly realised that the homes that they're sending those people back to are making them sick really, really quickly and sending them home. So, there was a lovely experiment of the hospital then being engaged in fixing the homes they were sending people back to because it was a better financial gain for them. So every time we do that, it's clear that there are advantages. I'm in South Australia, so I gave a talk and the head of a major hospital came up to me afterwards and said, "Oh, housing. Actually, we do get all these people that come back, and I suspect they're, going back to somewhere really, really bad and coming back with respiratory illnesses. Maybe we could do something about." So I think any time, we do ourselves a disservice, I think, in housing by splitting it off from the other bits of government. And housing's expensive, so there's an advantage in all of the other silos staying well away from us, I think. But, our job is to now, be making those arguments about the links so that, housing is an education problem, housing is a health problem, etc. I'm sure there's a comment from everyone on that.
Look, we've operated Housing First programs. The evidence is there. You can end homelessness by taking a person and putting them straight into a house with wraparound support. But what we see continually is a reinvention of the pilot program around Housing First in most states. And really, even once people are stabilised, I really want to say how important just providing a home for people in need is. Yes, it provides a platform for engagement in employment, in education. It helps to reduce those costs on the broader parts of the service system, but it is a really important role, particularly as we target social housing down to the most complex needs and vulnerable in our community. But we've done the research. We know that Housing First works. We know that there are savings to other parts of the system, particularly in terms of health services, emergency services. In Sydney, we have St Vincent's Hospital. They fund their own homelessness outreach service from the hospital that works with clients who are frequent flyers. The issue is goes back to that silo mentality, I think, that we see across state government agencies and with the federal government as well, that housing costs a lot of money, and at the beginning it is borne by one part of the system. And so making that case about the savings within the emergency department, within the health system, keeping kids at school, or even evicting people out of social housing and ending up in homelessness to come back into the system again, it's hard to track that. And so it's really promising to see the work that they're doing in Victoria to actually make that case about how it broadly can save money across the system. But yes, at first someone wears the responsibility and the brunt of that investment, and trying to get that as an outcome for the whole system is what we need. An accountability for all agencies around ending homelessness and keeping people housed. And then you'll start looking at innovative ways of doing that across systems.
Just quickly on that, I'm aware of things happening in Perth, in Brisbane, the Royal Women's Hospital for homeless women who are pregnant. That's philanthropy. The Brisbane one had to be a fair bit of philanthropy. Most of them have to be pushed against the grain and continually pushed against the grain, but it's incredibly obvious that they're needed. So that would be a really a good breakthrough if health and housing homelessness could get it together.
You would think at the as we're emerging from a pandemic, it would be pretty obvious that there's a strong connection between health, housing, education, work, all of those things. So now is the time, I think, to make those points.
Now is the time. We have a federal election coming up, and I'd need to ignore quite a lot of questions to not point this out. Adrian, how do we get housing as a key focus in the coming election campaigns?
The eternal question, really.
Well, it's eternal, but it's now.
Yeah, it is now. Well, I think it is a question whether I don't think we have to make it a question. I think the rise of housing inequality that we've seen in the last 2 years makes it a question. How each party responds to that. The fact that, for example, all the stimulus that the government found in terms of housing went to homeowners, the private sector, all of it flowed that way is a pretty obvious place to start. The National Affordable Housing Alliance has been working quietly with representatives to this point. There may be further actions that it takes. National Shelter will be producing a checklist of party responses on our housing platform. So we produce our own policy platform, and we've asked the parties to respond to that rather than, you know, look at their announcements. We're saying, you know, do you support a national housing strategy? Yes, no. Right? We will create a checklist against all of our policy priorities so that people can be guided on that. Ultimately, it will come down to the people thinking that housing is a big enough issue that makes the parties respond to it. You know, it's always thus.
Thank you, Adrian. I'm going to cut you off there because we're about to lose the video feed. In response to some questions today and yesterday as well, I want to acknowledge that we did invite the Federal Minister to speak at this conference. He had a prior engagement, but has now sent a pre-recorded message, which I believe is being made available on the conference app, if it hasn't already. But at this point, I want to thank all of the panellists for their willingness to be here today and for a really interesting and wide-ranging conversation. Please join me in thanking our panellists. And thank you again to Link Wentworth for sponsoring this session. It's lunch. Thank you.